And that takes us to item 8. The principal planner is Barry Mosley, who's the author of the report. And this, I think, is relatively straightforward because it builds on a conversation, members, that we had at the governing body. I think we're going to have Barry online. We've also got the Manager of Plans and Places, John Dogood, who's also the authoriser of this report, in the room. Barry, can I hand to you now, please? Just check that Barry Mosley, the principal planner, is connecting in. Barry, are you with us, please?
If Barry's not there, we have Phil Reid on standby, hopefully, with his Skype ready to go. Phil, are you there?
Phil Reid, are you with us, Phil?
Can you hear me, Chris?
We can hear you, Phil. Would you like to proceed with the presentation?
Yep.
Hello, can everybody hear me?
That's okay. We're back to Barry. So this is COVID-19 life. And Barry, can I ask you to proceed, please? We have the first slide on our screens.
Yeah, I don't seem to have any audio at my end.
Okay, Phil Reid, can we go back to you, please,
Yes.
and we'll proceed with you.
Yep. Okay, so what we have here is the response to the governing body recommendation to be able to proceed with two aspects in relation to rainwater tanks. The first is the main subject of this report, which is...
I'm assuming I'm audible. Getting a
just a minute.
The slide here.
Barry, if you can't hear us, we'll have to go with Phil. So members, apologies. We'll get a message to Barry to mute. And Phil, if we can carry on with you, please.
Okay, I'll proceed. Okay, so can I draw everybody's attention to the slide which we see on screen here and the upper half of the slide. We have been able to respond to the enabling aspect of the governing body recommendation for making it easier for people to place rainwater tanks within residential properties, within rural properties, and within properties on the Hauraki Gulf Islands. We believe that we'll be able to do that through making a modification to our definition within the unitary plan of building by adding in a specific definition for rainwater tanks, by including rainwater tanks as a permitted activity within our activity tables, and by including standards that are particular to rainwater tanks that look to enable them on properties whilst at the same time protecting the amenity values of sites and adjoining sites. The second aspect of the report, which is what was also spoken to by Lucy Rutherford, is the mandatory aspect, which is looking to make it a requirement to have rainwater tanks. We do want to actually take longer on this approach because we do believe that there are some other viable options that need to be looked at closely, in particular a bylaw approach or a direct advocacy for changes to the building code. This is on the basis that by mandating the requirement for a rainwater tank, we would need to make it a prohibited activity to not have a rainwater tank on a property, and in order to cross that bar within the Resource Management Act, there needs to be a significant case built. So we do want to look at other options as well. So we do wish to take further time on that one before coming back to you in April next year on that. But we do believe that we'll be in a position to be able to sit with delegated members at the end of next week to go through the detail of what I've just outlined of changes to the plan to get approval to notify a plan change. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil. And so, members, I'll move this motion. I'll put it on the table. Councillor Walker, are you with us now? Would you like to second?
Happy to second.
Thank you, Councillor Walker. So it's moved and seconded, members. I'll take questions now, starting with Member Henere.
Kia ora, Chair. Look, and please excuse my ignorance about which water tanks we are talking about. So we are talking about water for what?
Through the Chair, this is making provision for people to be able to put a rainwater tank on their property for use for garden purposes. If they wish to go further than that and provide it for either grey water or for potable use, then they will need to also meet other requirements under the Building Act as well. But that would be a choice of individuals, whether they take those extra steps themselves. We're making it easy for them to be able to place the physical tank on their property.
So my question is, and in my question is my comment, is why can't we just allow for the installation of drinking water? Basically, that's what I'm talking about. Is water that you use for cooking or use for drinking. I'm just going on my own experience down the coast, down the east coast. Mother-in-law has a place, and we have a pretty huge water tank that we draw not only from rainwater but also from river water, and we use that water for 100% everything basically. So I'm just wondering whether we are going or not going far enough with the allowing for residents to have, making it easier for them to go the whole 9 yards rather than just 2 yards, so you can water your garden.
Through the chair, this plan change goes as far as we can on the actual location of the structure itself. We will also at the same time be having conversations with both the building consents part of council and with Watercare in relation to the potable use from these water tanks within urban areas. At the moment, there is the requirement that separate approvals are needed outside of the Resource Management Act to be able to use these water tanks for potable use within urban areas. But we do see the intent of this to be able to make it easier for individuals to take that opportunity if they wish.
Can I just as a supplementary to that, can I ask for the legalese of what I'm suggesting? You must have a legal opinion on all of that.
Well, can I just come in there? Mr. Reid is not from our legal team. He's a very experienced planner, but he can't offer a legal opinion. And
No,
we don't
I'm not asking for his legal opinion. I'm asking if there is a legal opinion somewhere floating around which I could have a look at.
Phil, can I go back to you?
Yes, I mean we can search for whether there is an existing one, but I think that what is being requested here is a set out of what the law says for whether individuals in an urban area wish to use a rainwater tank just for garden purposes, or if they want to step it up and use it for grey water purposes, or if they want to step it up again and use it for potable purposes. So we could provide a piece of legal advice on what the law says for those three instances.
Yeah, that'll do. Thank you.
Thank you, Member Henry. Councillor Walker, you have a question? Councillor Walker, are you with us for a question, please?
Sure. So my question goes to how this particular piece of work fits with a water conservation campaign, because quite obviously it is not going to deliver for quite some time. And if we are serious about water tanks, there is the possibility of a rebate on the part of Watercare to encourage people to install water tanks in other areas, but also other means of encouraging water tanks, which frankly we haven't done very well right now. And if you actually look at Watercare's website, it's and their advice, it's somewhat negative about the installation of water tanks. So as much and all as I support this, we need a more comprehensive approach around water tanks, Is that something that your committee can take up, Mr. Chair?
Yes, look, I'll ask the Chief of Strategy, Megan Tyler, to address that, Councillor Walker. Thank you for that question.
Thank you, Councillor Walker, and through the Chair. There has been a number of conversations about this over the last months, and this committee and governing body were very clear that they wanted Auckland Council and Watercare communications teams in particular to work really closely together around campaigns in these very areas. So I will take your comments back, Councillor Walker, and I will give it back to the teams that are working together around all of the water conservation kind of measures, websites, all of that kind of thing. And I will ensure that that is taken up. Thank you.
If I can add, Councillor Walker, if you received an electronic invoice from Watercare in the last week or so, it is dramatically different in its messaging on water conservation to the one that you would have received a month prior. Our political advocacy to Watercare over the last month has resonated, and the information that is conveyed in that invoice about water conservation has been phenomenally improved. The other thing I will also add that we have the Retrofit Your Home program, which incentivises water tank installation. So under the Retrofit Your Home program, residents of Auckland can make an application and receive support to go about installing rainwater tanks. But I agree with you, we've got a lot more work to do. Do you have a further question, Councillor Walker?
No, other than to make the observation that in the Q&A on Watercare's current website, certainly just a day or two ago, it was pretty negative about water tanks, but no doubt they'll pick up on that.
And with your and my advocacy, they will be. Thank you, Councillor Walker. Councillor Watson, your question, please.
Yes, I'm just trying to get a fix on what sort of tanks we're talking about here. So when we use the definition rainwater tank, is there a limitation on the size? I see references to heights and whatnot, but does it actually end up having a capacity limitation as far as the sorts of tanks that would be captured by this change?
Thank you. Phil Reid, can you take that question, please?
Yep, through the chair. So what we'll be looking at is particularly adjoining boundaries and the sizes of tanks within those areas. So from a market perspective, there are tanks which are of many different shapes and sizes, and we are going to be encouraging of people to be placing them in locations such as under the eaves within side yard areas, to be able to still ensure that there is a protection of sunlight access to closely adjoining properties and no other dominance type impacts on the use of adjoining sites. When you get further into the middle of properties, then there is a greater opportunity for tanks to be of a larger size.
Okay, so
okay, right.
So I think of the situation
Cool, thanks for that.
in areas that have have big tanks. We call them rainwater tanks, water tanks, in areas like the Hibiscus Coast, for instance, where you have tanks that are generally 20,000, 30,000 litres. They, in most instances, are, slightly bigger than what's permitted under a fence. They have a big storage capacity and often, or in many cases, are located in the corner of a boundary or at the back of the house or somewhere which is not particularly visible. So, for instance, no one has a tank in the front of their property or in a place that affects a boundary or a neighbour's sunlight in any way. But from what I'm hearing here, I'm assuming that larger tank, given that people wouldn't want to be duplicating this process by a whole lot of smaller tanks, that's not necessarily going to be permitted under this proposal.
Phil, can you take that one too, please?
Yeah, I mean, there are options for individuals as to how they actually place these tanks. So depending on whether you've got a gradient within your property, in many cases you'll be able to actually set these tanks slightly below ground and still get gravity feed through to where you wish to use it. One of the implications that we need to look at is the height of the tanks relative to the height of boundary fences, and where the tanks go above that height and are still right up against boundaries. So where there are sloping properties, then greater options exist, but I do take the point that some of the larger tanks that you find within rural areas may not be able to be located adjoining boundaries within residential sites in urban areas.
So, Mr. Chair, if I might make a comment in light of that information, it's pretty clear to me that the public perception of what's being proposed is maybe different than what the actual reality is on the ground. So, for instance, in areas where there are currently water tanks, when we talk about water tanks, we're talking about a 20,000 or 30,000 litre tank. That's kind of standard. What we're talking about here, in most cases, it would seem to be is tanks of a significantly smaller capacity. So I think there is going to be a real need to educate what is and what isn't encapsulated in this proposal. And alternatively, and I think one of the other councillors referred to it, in any campaign, the ability to go beyond that and what that involves, because the notion that, council's allowing water tanks, without any, of the restrictions that have existed up to now, it could be a little bit misleading. So there is quite a degree of detail and circumstances altering cases here that I think need to be explained more clearly than has been the case thus far.
Thank you, Councillor Watson, and I think that's fair comment. We are endeavouring to remove the unnecessary restrictions. We're not suggesting that we're removing all restrictions, because we could be compromising residential amenity values in doing so, and that's highlighted in the report, that the staff will be looking at the baseline amenity values that people in Auckland expect to endure. And I think the staff will be looking at a range of tanks. It is from the micro tanks to the macro tanks, from residential to rural. So they will be looking at all of that, and we'll be talking to our local boards in that respect, getting good input there, and then we'll be proceeding with the notification under delegation. The motion has to myself and the Deputy Chair and a member of the Independent Māori Statutory Board. But good points that you make, I'm sure, will get picked up, but we are definitely moving in the direction of taking away the unnecessary restrictions on the back of already incentivising rainwater tank installations by reducing the necessary expenditure that was in place before. Now, I have got another question from Councillor Hills, please.
Thank you, Chair. I guess my question follows on from both Member Henare and Councillor Watson, is just, maybe it's from Phil, if we could have a bit of just a definition of exactly what this would allow, because it is a bit confusing, because I thought we were going to go further, as Member Henare says, but then we are told the Building Act is not, we can't change the laws from our side of things, but we can already put tanks of up to 35,000 litres without a consent, as long as it's supported directly by the ground, for watering the garden or washing a car. There's a whole lot of other things on our website that show us what we can do. So I'm just worried that we might overblow what we're actually trying to change, unless I'm reading it wrong, but I kind of felt like we'd be going a bit further when it almost sounds like most of what this plan change allows is already allowed. Or am I getting the wrong end of the stick because, I guess I just want to know what changes, and is there a different mechanism that would give us more options, because we can do most of this for the watering of the garden or washing the car under quite a lot of different cases. So I just wonder if, from Phil, what exactly this would change. What is the expected take up of water tank usage if we went through this process that we can't already do? Because I kind of felt like maybe it would allow the use for, say, washing machines and toilets and things like that, but we can't actually change it through this process.
We've got Rachel Devine on the line as well. Now, Rachel's one of the project people on this particular plan change. Rachel, are you with us?
Hi there. Yes, Chair, I'm here. Taken in all of the questions there.
Rachel, did you are you able to respond to Councillor Hills's range of questions there?
Yes, absolutely. So the first thing I would say is the first part of the business case for the rainwater tank initiative was to remove barriers. So the removal of barriers is quite multi-layered, and I think something just to be really clear on is the difference between resource consent and building consent. The thing that we are tackling right now is the resource consent element, and that's where the unitary plan change comes in. What we've found is tanks within the unitary plan are, if they are over 1 metre in height, are defined as being a building. Now, what that means is all development standards apply to tanks that are over 1 metre in height. What we've also found from our research is that the fair majority of tanks are over 1 metre in height if they are to be a useful size. And that includes those 25,000 litre ones and over that you find in most rural properties. And it also includes the slimline tanks that we often find in residential urban properties. We've also found that, so it's the definition of the building trigger that we want to remove as our first step. And the reason for that is if a resource consent is required, the cost can be anywhere between $400 and $4,000 for a resource consent, and it is often triggered if a tank is over 1 metre in height. This is often more than the price of the tank itself. So that's our first step. The additional removal of barriers part is the building consent process and costs. There's a large amount of ambiguity regarding building consent costs, ranging generally looking at around $700 to $1,200 as a deposit if you would like to plumb your tank to your house. So the main trigger for a building consent is the plumbing of your tank to your house, and that is for anything from toilet use, laundry, drinking water, all of it. We have begun discussions on that with the building consent team, and we're trying to figure out now a mechanism on how we can remove that barrier as well. So I guess the main thing is just not to confuse the two, that the resource consent side, trying to remove the need for people to have to put down either anywhere between $400 and $4,000 is what we are working on right now. That is its own separate thing, and that is linked to the definition of a building and the 1 metre height. And then the separate thing that we're looking into is the building consent side of things, and that predominantly applies to tanks that are plumbed to your house.
Right, so in most cases, tanks are exempt from the building consent, but then they often trigger the need for a resource consent. And are we looking at something like, say, I know insulation, you need a resource consent in most cases, but unless you have a qualified person installing it, then you are exempt from the resource consent. Is that the way we're looking at it? If you get it,
So with regard to the resource consent is predominantly to do with the bulk or the size of the structure and where it is placed on the property. If if this plan change goes through and is successful, the hope is that people will be able to get a rainwater tank, install it on their property, and there won't be any fees for any resource consent fees. However, if they plumb the tank to their house, that's when the building consent side kicks in. So it's only if the tank is used for, it's either a top-up tank to an already existing tank, for example, rural properties may want an existing tank, top-up tank, which is already plumbed, so they wouldn't need a building consent. Or for urban properties that are looking at outdoor use only.
Yeah.
So I guess the thing to make really clear here is amending the unitary plan will not impact the building consent requirements. That's another area that we need to sort out, and it hasn't been done yet.
Oh, that's okay. And I guess my point was just in parallel, is there a way that is it up to us, or is that a government issue where we would get as long as you have a certified person plumbing it in, then you'd be exempt, much like we do with insulation. You need a resource consent if you do it yourself, but if you get a certified person to do it, you don't need. Is that the sort of direction we're going, or that we haven't gone that far?
At the moment, we're exploring all of the different options. So there's a large, one of the barriers that we're coming up against is the Health and Safety Act and the Health Act and the issue of backflow. Yeah. So we need to make sure that we're not compromising health and that we monitor how installations are done, especially where tanks are set up at a property that is also connected to the mains network, because if there's a situation where it isn't done properly and backflow happens, it can contaminate the water mains network. Yes. So it needs to be done right, and it needs to be, the boxes need to be ticked. It's not quite like resource consent, where it's really just about where your tank is placed, and we see that as a very straightforward thing to amend. But the Building Act, we need to make sure we're ticking all the boxes and we get it right, and that we aren't going to be negatively making decisions that might impact on public health if they're not done right.
Cool, thank you very much. And just my last comment, Chair, I guess if we can make sure, and I'm sure you will be, the comms from you, that it's clear exactly what, in layman's terms, exactly what people are expecting through this, and that work is being done on the other part, because I assume people, through this process will be hooray, and then realise that actually plumbing that in is a whole nother part of the ball game. So I understand where we're at now, but I just want to make sure that we're not giving people sort of false, not false, but an expectation that they're going to be able to suddenly get next summer have their tanks plumbed in where that process is separate. But thank you.
I think that's I note, Councillor, that is a very good point that you make, and I think we need to make sure we get that comms very clear, because it is confusing, the difference between resource consent and building consent and what requirements are, and we definitely don't want to mislead people into thinking that Christmas has come early when it's only a Christmas cracker and nothing's in it. We need to set the scene well and communicate clearly. So we're working with comms on that right now, actually. We have an engagement plan on Have Your Say that will be launched probably around the 27th of August. We're working on the content for that, but take on board all comments. Thank you.
Thank you for your explanation, Rachel. So, members, this is multifaceted, really. It's a little bit complex. And some good points have been made from the water conservation message of Councillor Walker through to some clarification on what are we doing in the building consent area as well. So today's paper is focused on removing the unnecessary restrictions in the resource consent area, and there is parallel work that will continue to happen, as Rachel has just outlined. Now I'll take a question from Councillor Newman, please.
Yes. Good morning. My question, I'm just a little bit confused. So I read the paper with respect to the benefits of the rainwater tanks and the ability to install a rainwater tank without the need to get the resource consent. I can understand that bulk and location means that it's been treated as a restricted discretionary activity, but I could imagine adjacent property owners or neighbours within a strata titled multi-unit residential dwelling would have an interest in this. So my question, reading the paper, what are the consequences for multi-unit residential owners here? For example, does this mean that I could get a tank installed, or does this mean that I could deny my neighbour the ability to install a tank based on bulk and location concerns in a strata title property arrangement, irrespective of the change? Because it seems to me that the change here really only works for fee simple single house zone locations, and that's not where the unitary plan is trying to go in terms of intensification of Auckland. I mean, can you comment on that? Because I just, in terraced housing and apartment settings, I'm not quite sure where you could put these tanks, and I'm not quite sure what agreement you'd need to get from the neighbours, but I'd assume you'd need to get some sort of agreement from the neighbours, irrespective of what this plan change would allow.
Phil, are you best placed to respond to Councillor Newman on that?
Yes, I can answer that one. So through the chair, the unitary plan does not cut across and change any existing private requirements that exist under the Property Law Act for the use of common areas or body corporate agreements or other arrangements that are in place where there is common ownership. So those obligations would still remain for everybody. You are correct that yes, in a straight fee simple situation, this plan change would enable for people to be able to place these structures in locations that they currently may not be able to. But it will not override any obligations where there are other property law related restrictions that exist on the property, such as if you are on a cross lease and you are placing it within a common area, or if you are on a cross lease and you need your flats plan updated. So those requirements would still sit with people.
Well, okay. Well, thank you. I mean, it's probably more of a comment than a question now. I think that that adds another dimension to this, because whilst I can see the benefit of this and I'll certainly vote for it, it would be very important to clarify that this doesn't cut across our Property Law Act obligations, and that therefore there is a big group of people in Auckland who won't necessarily enjoy the benefit of this because they live in a cross lease arrangement, and where they can expect that they would need to get the agreement of the other property owners within the complex, and they're unlikely to. So I do think that we'll need to just reflect a caveat around that as part of any communication.
Yeah, and that would not be dissimilar to many other land use activities that those joint owners want to achieve for themselves. Yes, they need to come to agreement. But I think the benefit for wider Auckland is going to be tremendous from this change. Councillor Cooper, please. Councillor Cooper, are you with us? Now, are there any other questions, members? I might just give a pause waiting for Councillor Cooper to come back on. Otherwise, I'll just go to the motion. It's moved and seconded. Look, I want to thank the staff for progressing this quite quickly. We've got considerable work to do, though. As I mentioned, it is complex. We're working on a number of fronts to take away various barriers. This is the resource consenting barrier, and when I hear from Rachel that people are paying an unnecessary $400 to $4,000 of their money, more than the value of the tank, to install rainwater tanks, you get to realise the absurdity of it. So this is a step to take away those barriers.
Hello.
Is that Councillor Cooper?
It is. Sorry, that the phone, when you're on the phone, it keeps getting muted for some reason. Look, I'm sorry, I'm flying blind here. I've got no internet at home at all, and so I can't see the reports or anything. But and it may have been asked in a roundabout way, or it's in the report. And I know this will all get teased out in the plan change, but my concern is that, as we know, often you can get overflow in tanks, and how does that get assessed if people just put a tank in and then there's overflows and it's flowing over overland flow paths into other people's properties or somewhere it shouldn't be? Is that one of the things that'll be considered? Because we already get issues with people's stormwater going onto other people's properties, but if you had an overflowing large tank doing that.
Phil,
hi,
can I
through the
ask you to
chair,
address
this
that, Phil? Oh, sorry, Rachel. Rachel, are you best placed for that?
I can step in here, Chair, briefly, and Phil, perhaps you'd like to step in if I haven't covered off. Through the Chair, answer to that question is one of the elements that we are looking to put into this proposed plan change is a rule around measures must be implemented to ensure that any discharge of water beyond the boundary of the site from the rainwater tank overflow pipes is avoided or limited as such that it does not cause any nuisance to neighbours.
Great. That's good. But what I'm saying is how does that then, if you don't need a resource consent and it's just a given, how does somebody check that without charging people? Because that would be a cost, right? That's what I'm trying to understand.
Yes, so this is another part that we've been looking into for the plan change, which is whether there should be a mechanism or a rule around that you must notify Auckland Council that you have followed correct setup procedures.
Okay. I'm just feeling like there should be some holes in that without a cost, and that's my concern is, as councillors, and I'm sure local board members, we get lots of complaints of people's stormwater going all over their place, and this could be worse, and we've got no real mechanism from, say, a building inspector that signs it off. It's still if we do that, it's still a cost. It's a trust issue. And then going back later and saying, oh, but you said you did, and then you didn't. How do you deal with that? Those are the kind of, I'm thinking of the fish hooks over time, that we're left with anomalies, that's all. But I guess I just hope that gets taken up in how we deal with it. You don't need to answer me now because it'll obviously be teased out over time. Thank you.
Thank you, noted. That's a very good point, noted.
Thank you, Councillor Cooper. Mayor, do you have a question or comment, Mayor?
Yeah, a couple of questions, if I can, Mr. Chair, and I'm sorry if these have been covered before. I've had a couple of phone calls in between. The first was we're confirming that the fees at the moment for resource consent have been suspended, so there's no fees chargeable at the moment.
That is correct.
Okay.
In the majority of scenarios, there are some certain scenarios where they do apply.
Okay. Do we have any information on whether that removal or suspension of fees has led to an increase in application numbers for installation of tanks?
We've had an increase in inquiries. I think people are a little bit uncertain about the building consent side of things, and I think the key message that I'm getting is that people want to understand that there's a full package before they commit. So building consent is the second element, which is causing people not necessarily to proceed. So we are getting some inquiries dribbling through, but the holdback is the building consent side.
My second question is about requirements for urban areas. I've got tanks, all of which I've installed myself. I'm just wondering whether I've done it legally. Are we required to have building consents or resource consents to install in rural areas?
First question through the chair in relation to do we need a resource consent to install in rural areas? It will depend on where the tank is placed and the size of the tank. So that comes back to the 1 metre definition rule and then consequently where it is positioned on the property. whether it would need a resource consent or not. And then the second question in relation to building consent. A building consent is always required if the tank is plumbed to the house, always. And a building consent is also required if it is on a stand, if it is on a supporting structure which is over a certain height. And I won't go into the detail of that. It's sort of a complicated mathematical equation, building consent equation.
Okay, my suspicion is that most people in rural areas aren't aware of the requirement even to have a resource consent to put a tank in or to add a tank to what they've already got. I certainly wasn't aware of that. My last question is about retention tanks that are required in a number of areas that don't that aren't being used for outdoor use because they don't have a tap involved. To change a retention tank to one that you can use on your garden, what does that require in terms of consents? And I presume it does require some plumbing so that you've got a turn off tap so it doesn't just automatically drain into your stormwater.
Through the chair, I can answer that question. So we have two different types of tanks. We have detention, just for background for everyone, we have detention tanks which detain water and slowly release it back to the stormwater system. So these are a stormwater management device. And then we have retention tanks which retain water for household use. And then we can get tanks that are a combination, dual tanks, which are a combination of retention and detention. A number of properties have installed detention tanks for stormwater use. And the question asked is around whether these detention tanks can be converted to be used for outdoor use or other reuse purposes.
Yep, that's correct.
The answer is yes. The detention tanks can be converted into being used for outdoor use. However, a lot of it depends on where they are placed and their setup. So if they, for example, are buried under the ground, the costs of reconfiguring the tank to a reuse tank could become very high because excavation would be required and new valves would be required, and the positioning of the outlet would need to be amended, and that can become a very costly task. If the tank is above the ground, though, and the reuse requirement desired is for an outdoor use only, this can be done in a way that is not as expensive and is a lot more simple to do. But I guess the short answer of the question is that really it would be advised to get an engineer to look at the setup of the detention tank to understand whether the cost implication of converting it to a dual purpose tank is worth it or whether it's better to get an additional retention tank.
Okay, that sounds a bit like a barrier to somebody considering it, because if you're paying engineers' fees, you're probably not going to do it. But do you need a resource consent in order to convert a detention tank into a retention tank?
As long you would not need a resource consent as long as you're not changing the natural flow path of the stormwater outlet. Mm-hmm. If that is being amended, then yes, you would. If it is remaining the same, it wouldn't. And if the tank is going to remain in the same place, then from a location perspective, it is fine. There wouldn't be a resource consent required. If the tank is the water is only going to be used for outdoor use and not plumbed to the house, no building consent would be needed either.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. Are there any other questions, members? Then I think we'll go to the vote. I think most things have been said. Thanks to the staff for looking at this and looking at it promptly, giving it priority. We'll see this notified not so much shortly. There is some work to be done, and we need to take some feedback from iwi and local boards, of course. So, members, I think we've covered the ground well. It's moved and seconded. All those in favour say aye.
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 Contrary, no. And I'll declare that carried unanimously. Thank you, members. And thank you to the staff. Thank you to Barry Mosley, who wrote the report but unfortunately couldn't get online, and Phil Reid, who managed to support us here today, and Rachel Devine.